So before we get into it, what I need to do is take a minute to explain how our passage is laid out so that you can understand what we're going to do with it. First, we have pretty clear bookends on both sides of our passage. In chapter 13, verse 31 through 35, Jesus talks about glorifying the Father, that he's leaving, and he gives the disciples a new command. And then at the end, in chapter 14, verses 12 through 14, Jesus talks about answering our prayers so that the Father would be glorified. He talks about leaving, and then he gives and then he talks about the works that we'll do. So in both the front and the back, we see this commandment or works. We see that Jesus is leaving, and we see this idea of glorifying the Father, which leaves us the three questions in the middle: Peter asking where Jesus is going, Thomas asking how to get there, and Philip asking to see the Father, to each of which Jesus gives both a correction followed by an encouragement. Now, the reason I need to point that out is because normally I would tell you what this passage is about right at the beginning. Normally I'd say, here's what we're going to see, but I can't do that this week until we understand these three questions and where they're coming from. So we're going to spend most of our time this morning unpacking these three questions the disciples ask, and then I can explain to you what it means. So, remember last week, after we heard Jesus instruct the disciples to follow him, and after he washed their feet, follow them in humble service, he told them someone was going to betray him. Which is why, if you look at the last verse that we saw last week, John 13, verse 30, it says, "So after receiving the morsel of bread, he," that's Judas, immediately went out, and it was night. Now, John didn't include that detail, that it was night, just so we would know what time it is. Remember, light and dark plays a big role symbolically in the Gospel of John. Meaning, John wants us to know that when Judas left to betray Jesus, it was as dark spiritually as it was physically. Which amplifies what Jesus says in the very next verse. Because in the very next verse he says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." So imagine what must have been going through the disciples' minds. Like, hold on, you just said you're going to be betrayed, but now you're saying it's time for you to be glorified? How does that work, Jesus? Because then in the very next sentence, after saying it's time for his glory, Jesus says in verse 33, "Little children, yet a little while I am with you, you will seek me. And just as I said to the Jews, so now I say also to you, where I'm going you cannot come." Wait a minute. Slow down, Jesus. First you say you're going to be betrayed, and then you say it's time for your glory, and now you're telling us that you're leaving? I mean, try to imagine the disciples' confusion and uncertainty as they're just pelted with this barrage of new information that Jesus is giving them. Because it helps us understand why Peter asks in verse 36, "Lord, where are you going?" And then Jesus said, "Where I'm going, you cannot follow me, but you will follow me afterward." To which Peter replies, "Why not? I'll lay down my life for you." Now, this is one of those points where it's really easy to beat up on Peter. Because we know in hindsight just how much of his foot he's going to put in his mouth. But we have to remember that in spite of all of his faults, not only was Peter the first one who confessed Jesus as the Christ, but after everyone else had left Jesus, and Jesus was alone with the disciples and asked them, "Are you going to leave too?" Peter was the one who said, "Where are we going to go, Lord? You're the one who has the words of life." Not to mention, I don't know about you, but I've never walked on water. Even for however many seconds he did, Peter walked on water. I'd never done that before. So we need to be fair with Peter, because to some extent, he really means what he's saying to Jesus here, that he would lay down his life for him. In fact, John tells us in chapter 18 that none of the other disciples pulled out their sword and started cutting off pieces of the soldiers that came to arrest Jesus. So again, try to put yourself into Peter's shoes. Because for all of his faults, he is desperately devoted to Jesus. He is all in. But now, not only is he being told that Jesus is leaving, But how hurt and confused must he have been when his devotion collided with Jesus' prophecy that he would betray him. In other words, the better we understand how Peter must have felt at that moment, the better what Jesus says in chapter 14, verse 1 comes into perfect focus. Let not your hearts be troubled. You see, the correction in Jesus' answer to Peter was, no, Peter, you won't lay down your life for me. In fact, when the rubber meets the road, you're actually going to deny even knowing me. But rest assured that if I leave, it's to prepare a place for you to join me when I return. So how much can you relate to Peter? And I don't mean like how far can you put your foot in your mouth. I'm pretty sure we're all pretty good at maybe fitting both of them in there. I mean, how desperately do you want to be with Jesus? How much does it bother you that he's gone? How anxious are you that all you can do is read about him and not spend time with him? Because listen, our answer to questions like that, it exposes what's fueling our desires in his absence. To say that another way, the amount of encouragement and hope and strength that Jesus' answer to Peter provides for us, it reveals what's driving our actions while we wait for him. Because what we're looking toward is what we'll be working toward. What we're looking toward is what we'll be working toward. So the correction to Peter's question is Jesus had to go where they and we couldn't. Because we're not capable of doing what he was going to do on our behalf. Peter, you can't follow me. Because I'm going to stand before God Almighty and drink to the dregs the mountain of sin that you are going to bring with you. And the same thing is for us. We couldn't have followed him because he was going to do something that we couldn't. He was going to drink to the dregs the mountain of sin that each one of us is going to haul in front of God Almighty. That's the encouragement. Jesus was able to take the white-hot, soul-consuming wrath of God on our behalf, listen, so that we could be reunited with him, to spend eternity with him in the place he's prepared for us. So what I want to do real quick is just take a moment to imagine what it's going to be like to be reunited with Jesus. It's okay. You're not doing anything unbiblical. Imagine what heaven's going to be like. For me personally, I'm a home builder. I can't help but wonder if there's going to be neighborhoods. Like, is there going to be a pastor's neighborhood? Maybe there's going to be a mom's neighborhood where every mother gets like 1,000 acres or something so nobody bugs them. I don't know. What about creation? I've thought about this. You know, when we think about creation, we just think that means us. But that's not what the Bible says. It's not like God stopped being a creator when he created us. So throughout eternity, what else is God going to create? What other beings? What other worlds? Or is that even limiting him too much? Like it's going to be beyond some kind of a being or a world, something we can't even imagine. What's God going to create when we're back in his presence? But more importantly, imagine what it's going to be like to have bodies that can stand in the presence of God without evaporating. Imagine what it's going to be like to have ears that can withstand the roar of multitudes upon multitudes of people and angels worshiping God in unison. While on the other hand, imagine what it's going to be like for Jesus just to show up randomly one day and say, hey, I thought we'd have lunch together. Friends, he's gone to prepare a place for us so that he can take us to be with him for eternity when he returns. So how badly do you want to be where Jesus is? How badly do you want him to return so you can be with him in his presence, in the place that he's prepared for you? We'll come back to that. But moving on, I love how Jesus says at the end of his answer to Peter's question, and you know the way. to incite Thomas to ask the next question he wants to answer? Lord, how do we get there? And Jesus is like, that's a great question, Thomas. I'm really glad you asked that. Because I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one gets to the Father except through me. And I haven't spent a lot of time on this in John, but this is the 6th of 7 I am statements that Jesus makes. And these are statements that Jesus makes. They all begin with the word I am, but they're statements that are intended to do a couple of things. The first thing Jesus' I am statements are intended to do is to clearly say Jesus is God. He's saying that just outright. Because the emphasis on each of these 7 statements is on Jesus calling himself I am, the name God gave himself in Exodus chapter 3 to Moses. But additionally, each of these I am statements are intended to isolate Jesus from everything and anyone else. Not just by saying that he's God, but to isolate him as being the sole person of a certain thing. For example, Jesus said, I am the bread of life, not a bread of life. He said, I am the door, or the good shepherd, or the light, not a door, not a shepherd, not a light. I am the only door and the only shepherd and the only light is what he's saying. And Jesus is saying the same thing in verse 6. He's saying very clearly, and listen, divisively, I am God, and therefore the only way, the only truth, and the only life. There isn't another. And so what does he mean by I am the way, the truth, and the life? Because Thomas asked a logical question. Jesus, you say you're leaving, but one needs to know 2 dots on the map in order to know how to get there. So we know where we are, Jesus, but where's the other dot on the map? To which Jesus gives Thomas the answer to both of those questions. When he says, Thomas, the other dot on the map is the Father, and I'm the way there. And I can't help but wonder if John didn't maybe edit out a little, like who's on first kind of conversation here. Like Jesus says, I am the way to the Father, and Thomas is like, yeah, but Jesus, you're a person, like not a direction. And Jesus is like, exactly, Thomas, you got it. And Thomas is like, no, but wait a minute, like, Jesus, we need a heading in which to travel. You're not a heading, you're a person. And Jesus is like, man, I couldn't have said it better, Thomas. That is exactly right. But joking aside, the point that Jesus is making is very, very important. Jesus wants to make sure that they and we understand that the way to the Father isn't knowing a list of directions. It's knowing a person. Knowing Jesus is the only way to God the Father. And I don't mean knowing him like knowing about him. Satan knows more about Jesus than any of us will know on this side of heaven. I mean having a relationship with him is what he's saying. A relationship that knows in our hearts and not just in our heads that Jesus is the only truth, that God is holy and we are not. And that the life Jesus can give us through faith in his death and resurrection is the only life that will restore us to God the Father. In other words, unlike some very important spiritual leaders have said recently, Jesus is the only way. Because he alone is the revelation of the truth, that we are sinners in need of salvation, and he alone can offer the only life there is to be had to restore us with the Father. Which brings Jesus to the correction that he gives Thomas in the first half of verse 7, which is, if you had known me, you'd have known the Father, because I'm the only way. But the encouragement he gives is, Thomas, that means you do know the way, because you know me, and therefore the Father. You know the way to get to where I'm going, not because you know the right steps to take or the right direction to go, but because you know the person you're looking at. You know me. In other words, saints, I want you to understand how profound what Jesus is saying. Ever since the beginning of time, literally at the beginning of Genesis, as long as people have ever existed, there's been only one thing, one venture that they've all held in common, and that's a desire to get back to God. All the way back to the ziggurats of ancient mankind, to the idols and the ceremonies of everything else in between, to the current casting aside of silly idolatry in exchange for just a flagrant attempt to make gods of ourselves through knowledge and power. At all times in human history, mankind has been consumed by one end. It's an insatiable hunger to get to God. And listen to what Jesus is saying. God chose for you to be born at a certain time, in a certain place, so that either the parents you were born to or someone you would meet during your life would at some point offer you the opportunity to know Jesus Christ, and thereby reveal to you what all of mankind has been searching for all time. You know what billions of people have wanted to know desperately. In other words, God could have chosen for you to be born to a 13th century BC Mesopotamian Hittite family. He could have chosen for you to be born in maybe the secular, philosophical 4th century Greece BC. He could have chosen for you to be born to a Buddhist Chinese family or a Hindu Indian family, but He didn't. No, I want you to try to comprehend that God chose to orchestrate both your existence and your life in such a way that, like Thomas, you too could know what the rest of mankind has been desperately searching for since the beginning of time. That you too could not only know, but you could know the only person who could reveal to you the truth that you need the life He died and rose again to give you. So how badly do you want to know Him? Like Thomas, how consumed are you with wanting to be secure, to have the assurance of trust that you don't have to worry about where you're going when you die, because you know that the only way to the Father is through Jesus Christ. You know that. Well, again, we'll come back to that. But in giving that answer, Jesus does it again. He makes a statement at the end of His answer to Thomas in order to incite Philip to ask the next question he wants to answer. He says at the end of verse 7, "So you do know the Father, Thomas, because you've seen Him." To which Philip is like, "Lord, if you're leaving, can you please show us the Father, and we'll be okay till you get back?" To which Jesus is like, "Man, you guys are on fire today. You're asking all the right questions." But the correction to Philip is do you really not know me yet, Philip? Like, I'm pretty sure I've said this a few times, but I and the Father are so close that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But look closely at the encouragement Jesus gives to Philip, because it's actually the same for us. Meaning, when Philip asks to see the Father, Jesus doesn't say, "Hey, Philip, do you look at my nose? Philip, do you see the shape of my face? Do you see how hairy my back is?" That's what God looks like. That's not what He tells him. The encouragement Jesus gives Philip is, you can know you've seen the Father in me if you've heard the words that I've said and seen the things that I have done. In other words, the way Jesus is encouraging Philip is so incredible that I don't think we'll truly be able to understand it or grasp it on this side of heaven. But let's try. Think about it this way. How do you get to know someone? Do you sit there and stare at them for hours on end? No. I mean, that might tell them a lot about you, but you're not going to know anything about them. How do you get to know someone? The way you get to know someone, the way you really see someone, is by listening to them talk and watching how they act. For example, anyone who knows closely a set of twins knows what I'm talking about. They look physically identical, but you see two completely different people because they speak and they act totally different, even though they look exactly the same. In other words, what Jesus is saying is if you listen to what He says and watch what He does, you've seen the Father. If you've seen who Jesus is through His words and seen what He's done through His works, then when you get to heaven, the Father ain't going to be a stranger. You're going to recognize Him. Which means this, brothers and sisters, listen, do you realize what you are holding in your hands is an intimate conversation with the Creator of heaven and earth? Do you realize that you can hear Him speak and watch Him work on those pages? The Father is revealing Himself to you. When you get to heaven and you hear Him and you see Him, you're going to be like, I've heard that before. You can hear Him speak, you can watch Him work, so much so that you will recognize Him when you get to heaven. That's what you hold in your lap. Not just ink on paper, but the very living words of God the Father in heaven talking to you about how He loved you so much that He sent Jesus to die in your place so that He could reunite yourself with Him in eternity. So how badly do you want to know Him? How badly do you want to see the Father like you see a friend? To know the Father like you know someone you're close to? Because here's the thing. Let's pull this passage together as a whole. Understanding where these questions are coming from is the key to understanding what Jesus is saying in the bookends. Because I think we're prone to think these questions are coming from these misguided, ignorant, uninformed disciples. That's what we like to think. Like they don't get it yet. I think of it like these guys are like the old farmer at a country church meeting where the pastor had called everyone together to approve a new chandelier for the church. And so they argue back and forth. There's a bunch of debate, and finally the old farmer can't take it anymore. And he stands up, and he's like, I am against buying this thing for 3 reasons. First of all, the church doesn't have enough money for it. Second of all, there ain't nobody here who can play it. And third of all, what this church needs is a new light fixture. I think that's how we see the disciples sometimes. As kind of these guys who are just too dumb to get it. When in fact, listen, that very idea exposes how much more important we think it is to know about Jesus than it is to want to be with Him. Sure, these guys didn't know a whole lot about Jesus, but they certainly wanted to be with Him. And don't get me wrong, knowing about Jesus is important. The Bible says we're supposed to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. But to understand this passage, rather than thinking these questions are coming from ignorant, uninformed dopes, we need to see these questions coming from men who desperately wanted to be with Jesus. Men who were rattled to their core when they heard they were going to be separated from the one who they loved so deeply. Men who desperately wanted to be assured that He wasn't leaving for good. Their questions reveal that these are men who would beg for just a glimpse of the Father to hold them over until Jesus returned. That's where we need to see these questions from. Because that's the only thing that makes sense of the bookends of this passage. So again, how about it, saints? How bad do you want to be with Jesus? How bad do you want to know Him? And how bad do you want Him to show you the place He's prepared for you? Only so you could say, Jesus, this is incredible, but could I just spend a little more time with you? How bad do you want to be in the presence of the one who, knowing He would have to die for you before the foundations of time, still chose to create you? How bad do you want to be in His presence? And if you do want to be in His presence, then how badly do you want to know better how to get there? How badly do you want to consume and study and grow in your relationship with the only one who can get you to the Father? Because if that's the case, then how badly do you want to taste and see that the Lord is good? How badly do you want to know Jesus more? Because the more you know Him, the more you know the one who sent Him. Because listen, here's the whole point of the passage. Our desire to complete the work Jesus is calling us to in the beginning and the end of our passage, more specifically, to love others and glorify God. Our ability and desire to accomplish that work is directly proportional to how much we can relate to these desperate men asking these desperate questions. It's directly related to how badly we want to be with Him. Meaning the love that Jesus is calling us to in John 13, 31 through 35, the work that He's calling us to at the end in 14, 12 through 14. Listen, it's a faith-fueled work. That's the main point of this passage. Loving each other and glorifying God is a faith-fueled work, not an obligation-fueled work. Think about it like this. When you learn to ride a motorcycle, one of the things you learn how to do is turn. And when you're turning on a motorcycle, you don't just look right there and see where you're turning. You're taught to look where you want to go, and then the motorcycle will follow. Like wherever you're looking, that's where you're going to go. And the same is true for our lives. Our lives are going to go in whatever direction we're looking. Our thoughts and our actions and our desires are going to go in whatever direction we're looking. In fact, let me show you how clear this was to John. And I don't want you to turn there. I just want you to listen to what John wrote many years later in his first letter in 1 John. I'm going to read you a few passages, and you listen to how much this affected him. If you want these verses, I can give them to you later, but just listen. In 1 John chapter 2, beginning in verse 9, John said, "Whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling." He says later in chapter 3, verse 10, "By this it is evident who are the children of God and who are the children of the devil. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is the one who does not love his brother." A little later in verse 14, chapter 3, verse 14, he says, "We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death." A little later in verse 23, he says, "And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son Jesus Christ and love one another, just as he commanded us." And then he said in chapter 4, beginning in verse 7, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love." In other words, I think it's safe to say that John saw a direct correlation between our love for each other and our love for God. He's saying our love for each other is the proof of how much we love God. John knew that our love for each other is fueled by where we're looking. So let me close with this. For some of you, I have a correction. Because the truth is, your lack of love for others in this body, your unwillingness to invest in people in this body, your unwillingness to sacrificially give yourself to others in this body is evidence that even though you might know a lot about God, your eyes are on your job or your calendar or your hobbies or any number of other things. So to you, I simply would say this, brother or sister, you're missing out. You are missing out. You're missing out on what is simultaneously the most difficult and yet the most satisfying and assuring and fulfilling thing you could ever imagine. To put it simply, Jesus says you're missing out on knowing God. However, to the others in this body, I would give this encouragement, and I would say this applies to most of you. The way you love each other, the way you devote yourselves to each other, the way you voluntarily lay down your time and your resources and even your hearts for each other is clear evidence that your gaze is firmly locked on Jesus Christ. I can't tell you what a blessing it is for me to hear through the grapevine all of the little ways that you love each other. The rides, the help, the counseling, the visits, the gifts. Even if you miss the mark, it's still such clear evidence of how badly you want to be with your Savior, which is also the greatest wish I have for you, because you couldn't do these things otherwise. You wouldn't want to. Because the work that Jesus has called us to of loving each other is a faith-fueled work. And so here's my challenge to you, Cedar Springs Church. I promise I'm done here. My challenge to you is to be a church, is to be a body that so displays the beauty and the grandeur and the wonder of Jesus Christ through your love for each other, that others want to know who you're looking at. I want others to look at this church and to see how we love each other and to begin to ask, how can you set aside this to help that person? How can you not participate in this to love this person? For it to be weird. To so love each other and devote ourselves to each other that God is glorified when those around us ask, what's fueling you? And we point to Him.